These notes are for the ready of 4.7H. We're going to look at two examples. The instructions or the question for this are fill in the following table. And the table given will look something like this. We'll have x and f of x, and then they'll give you some numbers. And then they'll also tell you what f of x equals. Now, generally speaking, the more straightforward of these types of problems for many of you is going to be when you plug in the 2 for the x. And simplify. And so that's what gets put here. The less straightforward, generally speaking, is when they tell you what f of x is. And that's generally just because you're not as familiar with that. When they tell you what f of x is, they're telling you what number to put here. So in this case, they're telling you to put 13. That's what I'm replacing f of x with. And then I write the rest of the equation. And then we solve, which is something that you by now are fairly familiar with. Add 7 to both sides. Divide both sides by 5. And then you can fill that into the table. The second example, same instructions, fill in the following table. This time we're calling the function g of x, but it doesn't matter what name they give it. But this time, the function that they give you is a recursive function. So before I start to do this work of actually filling in the missing pieces in the table, it's much harder to do this kind of work with a recursive. And so I'm going to transform this into the explicit. I know from my work in the first several modules that this plus 3 makes this a linear function, and that this plus 3 is what the slope is. It's what I'm doing over and over and over again to x. Adding 3 over and over again is multiplying by 3. I then have to sort of decide what to do with this g of 1 equals 7. Now, what we generally put here is the 0 term, not the first one, not g of 1, but g of 0. So this plus 3 tells me that the next term I'm adding 3, and then adding 3, and then adding 3, and then adding 3. But to get the g of 0, so we have g of 1 equals 7, to go backwards, I'm not going to add 3, I'm going to subtract 3. And so that gets me 4. So I'm adding 4. Now I can do the exact same work we did in the first example. So I'll start with the substitution, the plugging in of an x value. Simplify. Fill that into my table. Again, the part that generally is a little bit harder is what to do when we say g of x equals 13. But all that means is that I'm replacing the g of x with the number 13. I just replaced in this equation g of x with 13. Subtract 4 on both sides. Divide by 3 on both sides. And we find that x is 3. Fill that into my table.